In 1588, Spanish nobles packed their finest clothes for their victory parade through London. They brought musicians for the celebration, priests for the mass conversions, and specially designed torture devices for Protestant heretics. The Duke of Medina Sidonia even carried a detailed list dividing up English lands among Spanish aristocrats. Some nobles brought their personal servants and gold dinner services for the victory banquet they'd hold in Westminster Hall. 6 months later, those same nobles were washing up on Irish beaches, their frozen corpses stripped naked by local farmers, while crabs ate their eyes. Their golden rings had to be cut off fingers swollen by seawater, their silk undergarments torn away by waves, their noble crests meaningless to the Irish peasants who used their cloaks to wrap potatoes. This is the real story of how the Invincible Armada, La Armada Invencible, became Spain's greatest humiliation, how the most powerful empire on earth lost to a small Protestant nation, and how more Spanish sailors died from eating each other than from English cannonballs. Philip II of Spain had spent 2 years planning this invasion with obsessive detail. He called it La Empresa de Inglaterra, the enterprise of England, and treated it like a holy crusade blessed by God himself. The Pope, Sixtus V, had not just blessed the fleet, but promised Philip 1 million gold ducats upon successful invasion. Notably, he never had to pay. Every sailor received a special indulgence. Their souls would bypass purgatory entirely if they died in this holy war. Spanish priests held masses on 130 ships while holy banners flew from every mast, including one that had been blessed at the shrine of Santiago de Compostela. They weren't just invading England. They were saving souls from Protestant heresy, and every dead Englishman was a victory for Catholic Christianity. The preparation was staggering in its ambition and delusion. Spain assembled 130 ships of various types, galleons, galleasses, merchantmen, and supply vessels carrying 30,000 men. This included 19,000 soldiers, the finest tercios in Europe, 8,000 sailors, 2,000 galley slaves chained to their oars, and over 1,000 priests, surgeons, administrators, and even bureaucrats ready to establish Spanish rule. They loaded 2,431 cannons, 123,790 cannonballs, 22,000 pounds of gunpowder, and 7,000 arquebuses. The supply list reads like fantasy: 40,000 gallons of olive oil, 14,000 barrels of wine, 600,000 pounds of salted pork, 400,000 pounds of cheese, 6,000 pairs of shoes, 11,000 pairs of sandals for marching through England, and even 5,000 pairs of rosaries for converting English Protestants. But here's what the official records didn't show. Corrupt Spanish contractors had already doomed the fleet before it ever left port. The salted pork was actually rotting horse and dog meat, dyed pink to look edible and so rancid that sailors vomited from the smell when barrels were opened. The water barrels, supposedly fresh, were green with algae and full of dead insects. The ship's biscuits were so infested with maggots that sailors learned to tap them on the table to shake out the worst of the larvae, then eat in complete darkness to avoid seeing what remained. One Spanish sailor's diary recorded, "We called it walking bread because it moved on the plate. The cheese had turned to a gray, maggot-riddled paste." Sir Francis Drake later joked that Spanish corruption did half his work for him. But the reality was even worse. Corrupt suppliers had pocketed fortunes while sending 30,000 men to sea with provisions that were already killing them. The commander, Don Alonso Perez de Guzman, 7th Duke of Medina Sidonia, never wanted this job. He'd actually begged Philip II to choose someone else, writing with remarkable honesty, "I know by experience of the little I have been at sea, that I am always seasick and always catch cold. I have no experience of war or of the sea. I cannot even advise on naval matters without becoming ill." He suggested several other commanders, all of whom suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. Philip ignored him, believing noble blood mattered more than naval experience. So here was Europe's mightiest invasion force, led by a man who spent the entire voyage vomiting into a bucket while trying to read naval charts through watering eyes, commanding sailors who openly mocked him behind his back. The Spanish battle plan, developed by Philip II himself, a man who'd never been in a naval battle, was rigid to the point of absurdity. The Armada would sail up the English Channel in a crescent formation, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's 30,000 troops in the Spanish Netherlands, ferry them across to Kent, then march on London. Simple. Except Parma's army didn't have boats to reach the Armada. The Dutch rebels controlled the shallow waters where the rendezvous would happen. There was no deep-water port where the Armada could anchor safely. And the English knew every detail of the plan thanks to their spy network. Philip had essentially planned an invasion that required his enemies to cooperate. On May 30th, 1588, the Armada departed Lisbon with maximum pageantry. Cannons fired salutes, crowds cheered, priests blessed, and noble ladies threw flowers from balconies. It took the entire fleet 2 full days just to clear the harbor. A magnificent display of incompetence disguised as grandeur. English spies watched everything, counting ships, noting speeds, memorizing flags, and racing back to Plymouth with intelligence. One spy, Anthony Standen, even got himself hired as a translator on the Spanish flagship, sending coded messages hidden in wine barrels. Then God seemingly expressed his opinion. A massive storm off Cape Finisterre scattered the Armada, sinking 4 ships and damaging dozens. The storm was so violent that hardened sailors fell to their knees praying, believing the day of judgment had arrived. They limped into Corunna for repairs, where sailors started dying from typhus, spread by the lice thriving in their rotting supplies. The smell below decks became so unbearable that men preferred to sleep in the rain rather than go below. The English later found Spanish corpses with their bodies covered in so many lice bites they looked like they had smallpox. By the time they departed again on July 12th, disease was already killing more men than English cannons ever would. The hospital ships were full before a single shot was fired. The Armada's passage up the Spanish coast became a preview of disaster. Ships collided in fog. The Santa Ana fell behind and was never seen again. 400 men simply vanishing. Water barrels leaked, food rotted in the heat, and men started showing signs of scurvy, their gums turning black, teeth loosening, old wounds reopening. The galley slaves, chained to their oars, sat in their own excrement, the stench carrying for miles. Other ships could smell the galleys approaching before they could see them. When the Armada finally entered the English Channel on July 29th, English beacons lit up along the coast, fire signals relaying from hilltop to hilltop faster than any horse could ride. The beacon system, perfected over years of invasion fears, could relay a signal from Land's End to London in under an hour. Within hours, Drake knew exactly where they were, their formation, their speed, even which ships were lagging. Legend claims Drake insisted on finishing his game of bowls on Plymouth Hoe, saying there was plenty of time to beat the Spanish. What actually happened was even more insulting. The English were completely ready but wanted the Spanish to waste ammunition shooting at empty coastline, which they did, firing over 1,000 cannonballs at shadows and imagination. The first shock came immediately when the fleets engaged. English ships were smaller, faster, and lower to the water. Race-built galleons designed by John Hawkins specifically to fight the Spanish. Spanish naval doctrine demanded getting close, grappling enemy ships with hooks and ropes, then sending soldiers across boarding planks to fight hand-to-hand, basically land battles at sea. The Spanish soldiers, the feared tercios who dominated European battlefields for a century, stood ready in full armor despite the rolling seas. But the English refused to play. They stayed at distance using longer-range culverins, darting into fire, then sailing away before the Spanish could respond. Spanish cannons, mounted high for shooting down into enemy decks during boarding actions, couldn't angle low enough to hit the nimble English ships dancing just out of reach. Spanish Admiral Pedro de Valdez, watching his perfectly planned tactics fall apart, described the frustration. The enemy came and went like a musician playing a guitar, striking whatever notes they pleased while we could only watch. Our great ships were like chained bears baited by dogs, powerful but unable to strike back. The running battle up the channel lasted a week, a moving catastrophe of Spanish frustration. The English, fighting in home waters, could resupply ammunition and provisions from any port. Fresh volunteers rowed out to join them. The Spanish, meanwhile, were consuming irreplaceable supplies, their formation holding, but taking constant damage. The Nuestra Señora del Rosario, Valdez's own ship, collided with another vessel and lost her bowsprit, falling behind the fleet. Medina Sidonia made the heartless but necessary decision to abandon her. 450 men, and the Armada's pay chest left for the English. Drake captured her without firing a shot, finding 55,000 gold ducats that he somehow forgot to report to Queen Elizabeth. The San Salvador exploded when a Flemish gunner, angry over a punishment, allegedly threw a torch into the powder magazine. 200 men died instantly, their bodies blown so high that some landed on other ships. The survivors, horribly burned, were transferred to hospital ships where they lay in agony, their skin falling off in sheets. The surgeon's only treatment was to pour olive oil on burns, which actually made them worse. Those who survived the explosion died days later from infection, their screams audible across the water. By August 6th, both fleets were running low on ammunition, but the Spanish didn't know the English were almost out. Some English ships were down to their last dozen cannonballs, preparing to load whatever metal they could find. If Medina Sidonia had turned and attacked then, history might have been different. But he kept sailing toward his impossible rendezvous with Parma, following Philip's rigid plan even as it disintegrated. Then came Calais, and everything went to hell in one night of pure terror. On the night of August 7th, English fire ships approached the anchored Spanish fleet. 8 vessels, their guns loaded and rigged to fire randomly when the flames reached them, sailed toward the packed armada. Drake had spread rumors these were hellburners, the legendary explosive ships used at Antwerp 3 years earlier, that had killed 800 Spanish soldiers in one apocalyptic blast, throwing bodies a quarter-mile and creating a crater that exists to this day. They weren't actually hellburners, just regular ships set aflame, tar-soaked and loaded with anything combustible, but the Spanish didn't know that. Panic. Absolute fleet-destroying panic that turned discipline into chaos. Spanish captains faced an impossible choice: stay anchored and potentially burn, or cut cables and lose their anchors. Without anchors, ships couldn't stop, couldn't hold position, couldn't weather storms. Most cut and ran. In darkness, 130 ships tried to escape simultaneously. The San Lorenzo, flagship of the galleasses, crashed into the San Juan de Sicilia, tearing away her rudder. Both ships, now uncontrollable, drifted toward shore. The San Felipe and San Mateo collided so violently that soldiers were thrown overboard. Men who'd trained their entire lives for combat, drowned in darkness, pulled down by armor they'd polished that morning. The San Lorenzo ran aground near Calais Castle. French locals, technically neutral but always ready for plunder, swarmed the beached ship like ants on a dying beetle. The Spanish crew, including galley slaves still in chains, fought desperately, but the French overwhelmed them. They murdered the crew with agricultural tools, scythes, pitchforks, hammers, and looted everything while the rest of the armada watched helplessly. The galley slaves, freed by the French to get them out of the way, kissed their liberators' feet before fleeing inland. Many were recaptured and hanged days later. Dawn on August 8th revealed the armada scattered along the Flemish coast, their careful crescent formation destroyed. The English attacked immediately at the Battle of Gravelines, the only real battle of the entire campaign. This time they came close, within musket range, close enough to see faces, and unleashed everything. The English had resupplied with ammunition at Dover, and they used it all. Spanish sailors were cut down by chain shot. 2 cannonballs connected by chain that spun through the air, cutting men in half. Their blood made decks so slippery that men couldn't stand, falling into spreading pools of gore. The San Felipe took 200 cannonball hits in 5 hours, her hull looking like Swiss cheese, water pouring in faster than pumps could expel it. The San Mateo's mainmast fell, crushing dozens of men, their screams muffled under tons of sail and timber. One Spanish officer, Don Francisco de Bobadilla, wrote, "The decks ran with blood until it poured from the scuppers like rain from a roof. Wounded men fell through gaps torn by cannonballs and drowned below in water mixed with blood. Those who went to help them slipped in gore and fell themselves. I saw a man's head taken clean off by chain shot, and his body stood upright for 3 steps before falling. Another man, his legs gone, pulled himself along the deck by his hands, leaving a trail like a snail of blood, still trying to reach his battle station." The English revolutionary tactic of continuous broadside fire proved devastating. Instead of firing all guns at once, then taking long minutes to reload, English gun crews fired in sequence, creating a continuous storm of iron. Spanish soldiers, trained to board enemy ships, stood helplessly as cannonballs cut through their ranks. One Spanish captain reported counting his men after Gravelines. Of 400 soldiers aboard, only 50 could still stand. But the English were running out of ammunition again. After Gravelines, some English ships were down to firing plowshares, chains, and even cutlery. Anything metal that could be stuffed into a cannon. Lord Admiral Howard reported ships firing stone ballast and pieces of broken anchor. If the Spanish had known this, if they'd turned and fought, they might have salvaged something. Instead, Medina Sidonia made the fatal decision. With no anchors to hold position, unable to rendezvous with Parma, half his ships damaged, he would return to Spain by sailing around Scotland and Ireland. No one had maps of those waters. No Spanish navigator had ever sailed there. They were entering the North Atlantic in August, peak storm season, in Mediterranean ships never designed for those seas. The Portuguese pilots on the fleet had warned about this route, but they were ignored as mere Portuguese, not true Spaniards. They were sailing into the unknown with damaged ships, sick crews, and rotting supplies. Medina Sidonia issued precise instructions: sail north to 61, 5 degrees latitude, further north than the Orkney Islands, then west into the Atlantic well clear of Ireland, then south to Spain. Any ship that came close to the Irish coast would be destroyed. He might as well have ordered them to sail to the moon. Ships had no way to determine longitude, compasses were unreliable at those latitudes, and damaged vessels couldn't sail against the wind. The orders were impossible, and everyone knew it. The first horror was water. The cut anchor cables at Calais meant they couldn't stop to resupply. Water rations dropped to half a pint per man per day in August heat. Horses and mules, brought for the English campaign, were thrown overboard to save water, hundreds of animals swimming desperately in the ship's wakes before drowning. Then the water ran out entirely. Sailors started drinking their own urine, then progressed to seawater, mixed with wine vinegar. The ship's doctor on the San Juan de Portugal described what happened next. Men's tongues turned black and swelled from their mouths like hanged men. They crawled on hands and knees, having lost reason, biting at the deck believing it was bread. Some threw themselves overboard in madness, thinking the sea was a field of green grass. Then came the storms off Scotland, storms that even experienced Atlantic sailors called unprecedented. Waves taller than the ship's masts, 100-foot walls of black water. Mediterranean vessels, built for calm seas with high castles fore and aft, acted like sails in the wind. They couldn't hold course, spinning helplessly. Ships flexed and cracked, their timbers never designed for such stress. Caulking flew out from between planks like bullets. The hospital ship San Pedro Mayor started breaking apart, water flooding through split timbers faster than 5 pumps could handle. As the San Pedro Mayor sank, wounded men trapped in the hospital deck could be heard screaming until the sea silenced them. The walking wounded tried to help, but were too weak to break down the barred doors, locked to prevent malingerers from hiding there. Survivors counted over 300 men drowned, many of them already dying from infected wounds. Their bandages, soaked in blood and pus, floated for miles, creating a trail that other ships followed like breadcrumbs of death. The Gran Griffon, flagship of the supply squadron, lost her mainmast in a storm, then her foremast, leaving only the rear mizzenmast. She couldn't sail against the wind, only drift where storms pushed her. For 7 weeks, she drifted helplessly, her crew eating rats, then leather, then sawdust mixed with olive oil to make a paste. When she finally wrecked on Fair Isle between Orkney and Shetland, only 50 of her 300 crew could walk. Scottish islanders, themselves near starvation, couldn't feed the survivors. Spanish sailors traded gold coins for handfuls of oats, buttons for seabird eggs. Many died on Fair Isle, their bodies burned for fuel during the bitter winter. By the time the scattered armada reached Ireland's west coast, men were dying faster than they could be thrown overboard. The Rada and Coronada carried 419 men when she left Spain. Only 9 were still alive when she wrecked in Blacksod Bay. Bodies were kept on deck because no one had strength to lift them. Below decks, the dying lay in darkness next to the dead, no one able to tell the difference. Ships became floating coffins, the living and dead indistinguishable in the darkness, rats feeding on both equally. The Irish coast turned into a 300-mile graveyard of unprecedented scale. At Streetos Strand in Sligo, September 25th, brought apocalypse. 3 ships, the Lavia, Juliana, and Santa Maria de Vison, were driven onto the beach in a single day by the same storm. Over 2,100 men drowned in sight of land, many of them noblemen in armor who sank like stones. The beach was covered so thick with corpses that locals could walk on bodies for a mile without touching sand. Captain Francisco de Cuellar, one of only a handful of survivors from the Lavia, left the most detailed account. The beach was full of corpses. The waves had stripped them naked as the day they were born, and they lay in rows like white fish. Most strange was how they sorted themselves. The gentlemen in their armor had sunk and washed up together, while common sailors floated and gathered elsewhere. Irish peasants moved among them with hammers and knives, breaking fingers to get rings, smashing teeth for gold fillings. I saw one woman using a knife to cut a gold chain that had embedded itself in a drowned man's swollen neck. Children picked through the bodies looking for buttons and buckles. When English soldiers arrived, I hid under corpses, covering myself with dead men and seaweed, breathing through a piece of driftwood. I lay there from dawn to dusk, feeling crabs eating the bodies around me, their little feet walking across my face. The English Lord Deputy of Ireland, Sir William Fitzwilliam, had issued explicit orders. All Spanish to be killed wherever found, no quarter to be given. His reasons were practical. He couldn't feed prisoners and feared Spanish soldiers might inspire Irish Catholic rebellion. At Dunanoir, 600 Spanish survivors who'd made it ashore were marched to a field and systematically executed. English soldiers complained their swords became blunt from cutting through so many necks. They switched to using hammers and clubs, crushing skulls like eggs. The massacre took all day, executioners working in shifts. But the Irish poor got their revenge on both Spanish and English. They stripped corpses of everything, clothes, buttons, belt buckles, even pulling out gold teeth with blacksmith tongs. Bodies washed up for months after the wrecks, and each tide brought new harvests. Local folklore tells of families who became wealthy overnight, of peasant women wearing Spanish silk under their rough wool, of Irish chieftains buying land with Spanish gold. Some families built houses from ship timbers, their homes smelling of tar and salt for generations. In County Mayo, locals still point to stone walls containing Spanish cannons used as building material. The Girona, trying to rescue survivors from 2 other wrecks, packed 2,300 men onto a galleass built for 500. Almost all were young Spanish nobles, the flower of Spanish aristocracy, younger sons seeking glory in the Great Crusade. The ship, so overloaded she could barely float, hit rocks off the Giant's Causeway on October 26th. Witnesses said the sea turned red for miles, stained with noble blood. Bodies of young nobles in armor sank immediately, while common sailors in cloth floated, creating a grotesque sorting of the dead by social class. Only 9 survived from 1,300. In Spain, 260 noble families lost their heirs in that single wreck. The disaster was so complete that Philip II banned the families from wearing mourning, fearing it would demoralize the nation. On the Trinidad Valenciera, wrecked in Kinago Bay, survivors faced a different horror. Local Irish clan leader Sorley Boy MacDonald initially offered help, seeing opportunity for ransom. He separated officers from common soldiers, promising both groups safety. The officers were ransomed to Spain for substantial gold. The common soldiers were sold to the English authorities who hanged them in batches. But not before stripping them. Spanish soldiers were marched naked through Irish villages to the execution grounds, locals throwing stones and dung at these invaders who'd come to restore Catholicism, but brought only death. Ships that avoided Ireland faced the North Sea winter. The San Pedro El Mayor started taking on more water than pumps could handle. The decision was made coldly. Wounded and sick would be thrown overboard to lighten the ship. The ship's priest, Father Antonio, refused to participate, saying it was murder. The crew waited until he was asleep, then threw 60 men overboard, some pleading for mercy, others too weak to resist, several trying to swim after the ship until exhaustion took them. One young soldier, barely 16, clung to the side until they broke his fingers with an oar. The ship sank anyway 2 days later with all hands. On ships still sailing, rations ran out completely. The Hospital de San Diego's crew ate rats, catching them with improvised traps baited with dead men's hair. When rats ran out, they ate leather, Belts, shoes, even the leather wrapping on ropes boiled in seawater to soften it. When that ran out, lots were drawn. The Journal of Survivor Juan de Nova records the horror matter-of-factly. "We ate Antonio yesterday. He was thin from sickness, stringy. Today we draw lots again. The cabin boys are exempt. We need them to sail." Martinez drew the short straw. He begged, but rules are rules. "We will eat him at sunset." Disease exploded in the confined spaces. Typhus, spread by the billions of lice infesting every man, killed soldiers in days. High fever, delirium, then death. Scurvy rotted gums until teeth fell out. Sailors would find their teeth embedded in the rock-hard biscuits they tried to gnaw. Dysentery turned the lower decks into sewers of liquid feces. Men lay in their own filth, too weak to move, rats eating at their sores while they still lived. On the San Juan de Sicilia, so many men had dysentery that the bilge pumps clogged with human waste. The ship literally filled with sewage, men drowning in their own excrement as the vessel settled lower in the water. The Nuestra Señora del Rosario limped into Blasket Sound in Ireland, with only the ship's boys still alive. Every adult had died of disease or starvation. The boys, some as young as 10, had survived by hiding food and water, letting the adults die around them. They'd continued sailing by instinct, not really understanding navigation, just keeping the coast to their left. Irish fishermen found them days later, living among corpses, having gone feral from the experience. They bit and scratched would-be rescuers, defending their ship of the dead like wild dogs. When finally brought ashore, they couldn't speak, just made animal sounds, and had to be retaught human behavior. The Santa Ana de la Carrera made it to the Bay of Biscay before running out of everything. The crew drew lots for who would be eaten, but the man chosen, a gunner named Pedro Diaz, offered a deal. He knew where the officers had hidden a private food cache. He'd share it if they spared him. They found the cache, enough for 2 days, then ate him anyway. His bones were still on deck when the ship reached Santander, the crew too exhausted to throw them overboard, or too accustomed to horror to care. When the first Armada ships reached Spain in September, port authorities thought they were ghost ships or plague vessels. The San Marcos entered Santander with 60 dead still on board, the living too weak to remove them. The corpses had been dead so long in the heat they'd liquefied, creating a black soup that sloshed in the holds. The harbor master, boarding the ship, vomited immediately and ordered it quarantined. Medina Sidonia had to be carried off his flagship on a stretcher, so sick he was given last rites. He survived, but never went to sea again, spending his remaining years writing letters begging Philip to forgive him for a defeat that wasn't his fault, haunted by the screams of drowning men, unable to eat meat because it reminded him of the cannibalism he'd witnessed. Philip II initially refused to believe the scale of the disaster. When full reports arrived, he locked himself in the Escorial Palace for weeks, refusing to see anyone. Half the Armada was gone, 63 ships lost, most to weather rather than English guns. Of the 30,000 men who'd left Spain, barely 10,000 returned alive, and half of those died within weeks from disease and injuries. The hospitals of northern Spain overflowed. Santander had to dig mass graves. Entire Spanish noble families had no male heirs. The financial cost, 10 million ducats, bankrupted Spain, forcing Philip to default on loans, ruining Italian and German banking houses. But Philip's public response was surprisingly philosophical. "I sent the Armada against men, not against the winds and waves of God." Privately, he was less accepting. He ordered the arrest of several commanders, though most were already dead. He blamed everyone except himself. The man who'd insisted on an invasion plan that required Spanish ships to rendezvous with an army that didn't exist, in waters they didn't know, during storm season, led by a man who got seasick in harbors. England celebrated with medals showing God blowing the Spanish away. Afflavit Deus et dissipati sunt. God blew and they were scattered. The Protestant wind became proof of divine favor. Elizabeth I attended a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral, where captured Spanish banners were displayed like hunting trophies. The Queen, ever frugal, complained about the cost of gunpowder used in the celebrations. Drake and the other sea dogs were heroes. though they carefully didn't mention they'd made fortunes selling Spanish prisoners as slaves to Barbary pirates, or that they'd executed wounded Spanish sailors by throwing them overboard because feeding prisoners was expensive. The propaganda war continued for years. Spanish accounts blamed the weather, cowardly allies, especially the Duke of Parma, and bad luck. Anything but English naval superiority. English accounts turned it into a David versus Goliath tale, conveniently forgetting they'd had massive advantages in logistics, intelligence, home waters, and that Spanish corruption had done half their work. Both sides ignored the real victors, the North Atlantic storms that killed more men than all the cannons combined. Archaeological evidence keeps revealing new horrors. In 1985, divers found the Girona wreck. Among the gold chains and jeweled crosses were more disturbing finds, surgical instruments still stuck in bone, indicating amputations attempted while the ship sank. Skulls showed teeth marks on arm bones, evidence of cannibalism in the final moments as trapped men went mad with hunger in the flooding holds. A cache of unopened love letters, never to be delivered, their ink still legible after 400 years underwater. Modern analysis of Spanish records revealed the supply corruption was even worse than thought. The contractors had not only provided rotten meat, but had counted the same supplies multiple times, pocketing the difference. Barrels marked as water contained sawdust mixed with urine. Medicine chests were filled with colored water instead of drugs. Gunpowder was mixed with coal dust to make it go further, causing cannons to misfire. Spanish sailors and soldiers never had a chance. They were betrayed before they ever left port. The Irish memory of 1588 remains complex. The Armada wrecks brought unprecedented wealth to poor coastal communities, more gold and silver than they'd see in lifetimes. But it also brought English military occupation and brutal reprisals against any Irish who'd helped Spanish survivors. Mass graves are still found, containing Spanish sailors and Irish peasants executed together, united in death by English brutality. In 1988, the 400th anniversary, Irish communities held memorial services for the Spanish dead, finally giving them the Christian burial they'd been denied. The Armada's failure changed history fundamentally. Spain never again challenged English naval supremacy directly. The wealth from Spanish wrecks helped fund Irish resistance to English rule for generations. Spanish gold buying Irish guns. Protestant England saw it as vindication of their faith, accelerating the colonization of the Americas as a Protestant enterprise blessed by God. The Dutch revolt succeeded partly because Spain couldn't replace the armies and ships lost in 1588. But perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. The myth of invincibility, Spanish or otherwise, died in the waters off Britain and Ireland. David could beat Goliath. Weather mattered more than righteousness. Corruption and incompetence could destroy the mightiest forces. These lessons echo through military history, remembered every time a superpower assumes victory is inevitable. The Armada became a cautionary tale. Calling yourself invincible is an invitation for the universe to prove you wrong. Today, Spanish gold coins still wash up on Irish beaches after storms, called Armada gold by locals who keep the location secret. Each one carries a reminder. 30,000 men left Spain believing God guaranteed their victory. They brought torture devices for English Protestants and lists dividing up English lands. They packed their finest clothes for victory parades and brought priests to convert the heretics. Instead, they became frozen corpses stripped naked on foreign shores, their grand Catholic crusade ending with crabs eating the eyes of nobles while peasants pulled gold teeth from their skulls with pliers. The Invincible Armada wasn't defeated, it was destroyed, humiliated, and fed to the fish. England didn't win through superior tactics or courage alone. They won because nature, disease, corruption, and human incompetence turned Spanish hubris into Europe's greatest maritime disaster. The enterprise of England became the catastrophe of Spain, and the bones of Spanish sailors still lie scattered from the Orkneys to Kerry, from Donegal to Dover, testament to the price of calling any human enterprise invincible. In Spanish military academies today, the Armada is still studied, not as a glorious attempt, but as a warning about rigid planning, corrupt logistics, and ignoring expert advice. In Irish folklore, the Spanish ghosts still walk certain beaches on storm nights, Noble phantoms in rusted armor searching for their gold teeth, their eyes missing, pecked out by birds 4 centuries ago. And in the English Channel, on foggy nights, sailors report hearing Spanish voices praying in Latin, the last words of drowning men still echoing across waters that swallowed an empire's ambitions and spat back only corpses and gold coins for beachcombers to find.